So joining us now to go more in depth on that particular issue is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He is with Children's Health Defense. And Robert, great to have you here. I really wanted you to be on this program today because of this issue specific to these vaccines. And I want to start with this question. AstraZeneca says 72% efficacy. Their stock dropped because of that. But the other three, Moderna, 94% efficacy. Pfizer, 95% efficacy, and Sputnik V, 92% efficacy. How can we believe these kinds of efficacy rates when we know that the best a flu vaccine has ever done is 60% efficacy, according to the FDA? Why would we believe that these vaccines all suddenly got it exactly right the first time around and in record time?
Well, my reaction, Ben, is actually let's talk about how they get those numbers. The way that they get those numbers is Pfizer gave 22,000 people the vaccine and 22,000 people the placebo. And then it waited until 100 people got sick from COVID, and it was double-blinded, supposedly, which we have to assume is true for the moment. And that means that neither the researchers nor the subjects, the volunteers or recruits, knew whether they were getting the placebo or the vaccine. And they wait for 100 of those people to get sick. And they waited till 95 people got sick, and then they unblind the study. And they look at how many of those people were from the vaccine group and how many of them were from the placebo group. And as it turned out, 95% of the people in the Pfizer study were from the vaccine group. And so that's good news. There's a couple of good things about the mRNA vaccine if they can actually get it to work, which I'm skeptical about, but I'm very open to. If they can get it to work, it would be much better. It would be preferable to traditional vaccines because it doesn't have the kind of ingredients. It doesn't need an adjuvant. It doesn't have aluminum. It doesn't have mercury preservatives. It doesn't have formaldehyde. And, some of them, the Moderna one doesn't have human fetal tissue. And so it's potentially a safer vaccine than the typical ones and the vaccines that we're getting today. The question we have is, how long does the immunity last? Is there immune enhancement? In other words, are there a certain percentage of people who are going to get the vaccine and actually get sicker from COVID, which is what they've seen in the past? And then the question is the side effects. And for the Moderna vaccine, 100% of the people had some adverse effects, many of them mild, after the second dose in the phase 1 trial. 20% of the high dose, 21% of the high dose group had serious effects, meaning hospitalizations or medical intervention required. 6% of the low dose group had serious side effects. So that means that it's a dose-related response, which is indicia of toxicity. The question is now, we have not seen Pfizer's safety data. So if Pfizer's safety data looks anything like that, then we have to question ourselves, is it better to get COVID for most age groups or to get the vaccine? If you're under 55, your chance of suffering an injury from the vaccine is about 1/10 according to CDC's own data, about 1/10 of the serious injury and death rate of the seasonal flu. So for that age group, any injury would be unacceptable from the vaccine, because if you're not going to get hurt by COVID, why would you take a vaccine that has maybe a 10% chance of hurting you? And particularly, we don't know what happens to people who have comorbidities. And so we really need to parse through the safety data and look at the safety impacts for particularly seniors, for the fragile elderly, and for people with comorbidities. Right now, one of the problems with the way that they did that test, Ben, is that nobody in the test died. So we don't know whether the vaccine prevents deaths or whether it prevents injuries, serious injuries, because those weren't tested for. And as you pointed out with the flu vaccine, what the Cochrane collaboration and what BMJ have said about the flu vaccine is that there is no proof that the flu vaccine prevents any hospitalizations or any deaths. It prevents, you have to give between 70 and 100 flu vaccines to prevent one case of mild illness. And in some cases of mild illness, it may make moderate symptoms more mild. Do we really want an $18 billion vaccine program that just makes moderate symptoms more mild in some affected people if it does nothing to prevent injuries, serious injuries, and deaths? And nobody can say that about this vaccine. We just don't know, because the tests, as Peter Doshi from the British Medical Journal said, and as Dr. Hazeltine from Harvard said, these trials were designed to succeed. They weren't designed to tell us whether this vaccine is going to prevent any injuries or any deaths, or whether it blocks transmissibilities. And this is the big issue. According to Tony Fauci, these vaccines do not block transmissibility. That means you get and we know that in the monkey trials, the AstraZeneca vaccine, the monkeys were still, after they got the vaccine, their symptoms became milder, but they were still transmitting COVID. So what happens when you give the population these vaccines and it doesn't prevent those same people from transmitting the disease? You simply turn them all into asymptomatic carriers. And that doesn't end the lockdown. It doesn't end the mask.
And isn't that,
end all
but
other precautions.
Even that idea, I mean, what you just said about asymptomatic carriers, if that is the case, if and I haven't, studied it well enough to know if that would be the case, but if that were the case, that it turned everyone who got the vaccine into an asymptomatic carrier, doesn't that do precisely what we're trying to prevent by creating lockdowns in the first place, by making people wear masks?
Exactly. It turns us all into kind of typhoid Marys. There was a very, very important study that was published this morning in Nature, and it was published by the WUHAN Institute of Virology. It was an extensive study that was conducted with the cooperation of the Chinese government, where they tested 10 million people. They were trying to figure out whether there is asymptomatic transmission in COVID. And what their conclusion was in this study is that there is no asymptomatic transmission. They tested 10 million people with not PCR tests, which, as you know, often exaggerate the, give us a lot of false positives, but they tested them with accurate testing. And of the 10 million people they found, I think there was only about 300 of them that were asymptomatic, and who were carriers, who tested positive and they didn't show symptoms. And they went out and they did extensive contact tracing, which they can do in China because everybody is followed around. And they were able to trace every single person that those 300 people ever came into contact with. And there was no case of asymptomatic transmission. So the scientists in the most important study ever done on this are now saying that asymptomatic transmission does not occur with COVID. That's the best science we have on that right now. And
right.
So
and as you said,
what you would be doing.
That was actually just published.
Yeah, it was published this morning. And what they were, so I have not read it all the way through. So excuse me if I got something wrong, but that's my kind of understanding from reading the abstract and glancing through the paper. But what could happen is that the vaccine could actually make things much worse, these vaccines, if they do not prevent transmissibility. And the weird thing about this, Ben, is that nobody from the press is asking the one question that counts. Do these vaccines prevent transmission? And if they don't, do they turn us all into asymptomatic carriers? And how does that work? And none of those questions are being asked. The press is focused on these big headlines that it's 95% effective, and nobody's saying against what? Against
Right.
mild symptoms. They're not saying,
So,
does it actually stop you from spreading the disease? And if it doesn't do that, then what's the point? What is the
well,
point?
that becomes the big question: is what is the point? I want to ask you though, about the fact that you've been so heavily censored on social media and your ability to speak, and primarily to question, because that's what I see that comes from your social feeds more than anything else, are serious questions. You just said the media won't ask the right questions. You've attempted to ask questions, but your voice has been silenced on these issues. It's not just about saying, well, no one cares what you have to say. It almost seems as if too many people maybe care about what you have to say, therefore they're not allowed to hear you. Can you just touch on that briefly for us? I mean, what has it been like for you for the last few weeks and months since essentially your social media has been shadow banned?
Well, it's frustrating. I mean, we've been censored for 15 years in the mainstream media, which, as you know, is pharma controlled. But we were able to talk pretty freely on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter until 1919, when the WHO made the announcement. WHO, which of course is controlled by Bill Gates, made the announcement that vaccine hesitancy was one of the greatest threats, the global threats to public health. Immediately after that, Adam Schiff wrote a letter to all of who's the head of the Intelligence Committee, by the way, to the chair of the Intelligence Committee, to all to the social media CEOs, and then met with them and asked them to begin censoring us. And, this has not happened before in American history. There has been, some kind of voluntary censorship, for example, during the McCarthy era, and there's been small outbreaks of censorship. But right now we have essentially the government using these social media platforms as surrogates to censor speech that challenges government policies. And so far, the courts have said that the First Amendment does not apply to those cases because these are private carriers. We've now brought a lawsuit against Facebook that says you're not a private carrier in this case because the government told you to do this, and you are coordinating the censorship, which they're open about, with WHO and with CDC. So you have CDC telling them what to censor and what not to censor. And then, the censorship, the fact-checking outfits that they're using to censor us are also, some of those are financed by government agencies. But we've said in this case, the First Amendment does apply in our case because they're actually censoring us as a surrogate of government action. And we'll see what happens to that lawsuit. I think it should win. The thing that people need to understand about the First Amendment, and I think Democrats have somehow forgotten this, which is shocking to me, being a Democrat, that the First Amendment, the founders put the First Amendment in the Constitution not to protect people who were trying to make, to speak popular words, or to protect speech that was convenient and that was agreeable and that was nice. They put it in the Constitution to protect inconvenient speech, unpopular speech. People, all of our rights are not to protect things that everybody agrees with, and particularly things that the government agrees with. Our rights are there to protect our capacity to express dissent. Against government policies, against pharmaceutical products, against, corporate power. And right now,
Sure.
and that is really the foundation stone of American democracy, that the founders said, when we were in England, If the king didn't like what you said, he could jail you. He could shut you up. He could close down your newspaper. He could silence speech. He could stop people from assembling. He could stop you from petitioning the government. And those rights are being removed from the American people. And for some strange reason, there's no broad scale protest about this censorship. And that is, those two things are worrying. One, that the censorship is occurring. And two, that, the large amount of the American people and the Democratic Party are not objecting to it, but rather they're endorsing it.
Yeah, in many ways. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you so much for your time today and speaking out on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Before we go, we were supposed to be wrapping, but we're going to bring in one more guest because we have an important guest to get to. Dr. Rainer Fuellmich is with us now, and he is in Germany, and my understanding is actually filing a lawsuit. Correct me if I'm wrong, filing a lawsuit over many of the lockdowns that have occurred around the world. And you say it's because of these, I'm going to read it here, current geopolitical changes in the world are regarded as crimes against humanity. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, we filed that lawsuit today here in Germany. It's part of a larger strategy of lawsuits. We are in very close cooperation with Bobby Kennedy's CHD and his team of attorneys. But this is the first step, we believe, which I think will attack the cornerstone of the current crisis, which are the PCR tests, because we believe, after having listened to dozens of experts since July 10th here in Berlin in our Corona Investigative Committee, we believe that this is a staged pandemic. This is nothing to do with health, but everything to do with what Bobby Kennedy just talked about. They're very concrete dangers for democracy, in particular for free speech. So we believe that in order to make this house of cards collapse, we have to attack the PCR test, because in the meantime, we have learned from the WHO that the actual danger of this so-called pandemic is no worse than that of a common flu at 0.14% infection fatality rate. And we also know that there are no asymptomatic infections. So what is left is the PCR test. We know that from listening to our witnesses, we know that this particular now so-called Dresden PCR test, which supposedly tells you something about infections, does not tell you anything about infections, but rather it is being used as a tool to keep people in panic mode and not ask any questions about what they are supposed to do, like mask wearing requirements, social distancing, the lockdowns.
Okay, so let me get a little bit of clarification here on some things. So you said that the lawsuit was filed this morning. Who have you filed against?
This is a defamation lawsuit. Our plaintiff is Dr. Wolfgang Wodak. I don't know if you've heard about him. He's the person who more or less single-handedly stepped in 12 years ago when something very similar to what's happening now was about to happen, namely the swine flu. He's the one who was then in a position of political power. He was a member of the German parliament, and he was also a member of the Council of Europe. And he managed back then to stop things from getting any worse, even though it had gotten pretty bad at the time that he stepped in, because they were already vaccinating people with a hastily invented vaccine, which eventually did a lot of damage to, I think, 700 children here in Europe. They're now permanently disabled, suffering from narcolepsy. But he's the one who stopped this. And he did great work showing to the general population throughout the world that even then this so-called swine flu wasn't any worse, was just a mild flu eventually, and that's what we believe this is.
So he's the person you're suing, though?
No, he's the plaintiff, and we're suing a group of people. Yeah, we're suing a group of people, so-called fact checkers, which they're not, of course. They're manipulating the truth. They're being hired by the corporations that Bobby Kennedy just spoke about, by YouTube, Facebook, and
Facebook and
Twitter.
Google.
Exactly. And we're suing them because, and this is clad in a defamation lawsuit. I'm doing this for reasons of burden of proof. This group of people is accusing Dr. Vodak of lying when he says that the PCR tests are unreliable and cannot tell you anything about infections. So we're doing two things. We're killing two birds with one stone. On the one hand, we're protecting Dr. Vodak, who is back in the picture now, and who's visible now for the general public, because, as I said, he's the one who did a great job 12 years ago, unmasking, so to speak, the swine flu. And at the same time, we're attacking the people who are behind this staged pandemic by attacking the PCR tests.
So when you say that you're attacking the PCR tests, what you're saying is you're doing that through a defamation lawsuit, if I'm understanding this correctly, saying Dr. Voda is being attacked on social media or censored or defamed on social media because of statements he's making about the PCR tests. Therefore, we are suing for defamation in order to force those fact checkers to present their evidence as to why these statements that he has made about PCR tests are untrue. Do I have that correct?
Precisely. And you even got the burden of proof correct, because it's up to them to prove that he's lying. But the complaint that we've written is very well stocked with lots of evidence already, testimony and expert testimony and publications by experts in scientific journals, including Professor Kemmerer, who is a biologist and immunologist at the University of Würzburg here in Germany, including Dr. Mike Yeadon. You may have heard of him. He's a former vice president of Pfizer. And I think he was, for 16 years, he was their chief science officer. But there's others as well. So this is not something to be taken lightly. And I think the other side will know this once they read this.
I think what's interesting, because obviously, just to be clear here as a disclaimer, I have no evidence that PCR tests don't work. I have no evidence that they're flawed. Having said that, this strategy is very interesting to me because of the fact that the fact checkers, let's be clear about this, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in the UK or here in the United States, right, or Australia, the fact checkers themselves never seem to present evidence as to any of the reasons why information is removed or censored, taken down, thrown down the memory hole. That burden has never been placed on them legally to say, we have proof that the person here is lying. They simply label you as someone who is untruthful or spreading misinformation. So the fact that they would be required to then come forward and present evidence that proves one thing or another, do you believe that you are setting a precedent by doing this that can be followed, almost a blueprint that could be followed in other countries as well?
Excellent. You got it. You hit it right on the spot. That's precisely what we're doing. That's why this is going to be a precedent. This is one of many, many, many complaints we're going to file here in Germany and throughout Europe through the other law firms in all the German-speaking countries, Australia, Switzerland. Austria, Switzerland, but also the other countries' lawyers who we cooperate with. But this same complaint is going to be used, or a large part of it is also going to be used by our American and Canadian colleagues, because in the meantime, everybody agrees. All the lawyers who have kind of dug into this, all of them agree that the PCR test is the cornerstone of this entire hoax.
And again, is there any evidence that you can provide today that shows the PCR tests don't work?
Yeah, there's no scientists in this entire world who will claim that a PCR test can detect infections. PCR tests are not designed for diagnostic purposes. They're not admitted for diagnostic purposes. I've seen all the videos by the inventor of the PCR. A PCR test is a great tool. It makes things visible to the human eyes which are otherwise not visible by amplifying it, by making those molecules that you take with these swabs larger so that eventually you can see what this is all about. But they are not in any way capable of telling you anything about infections, in particular not when these PCR tests are set at more than 25 cycles. Everybody agrees, because cycles of amplification, that is. Everybody agrees, including the New York Times, which is part of the mainstream media, which, again, as Bobby Kennedy just alluded to, is apart from investing their money in the pharmaceutical and tech industry, they've also, the other side, I'm calling them, they've also invested much of their money in the mainstream media. But even the New York Times, in an article that was published in August of this year, agrees that anything beyond 35 cycles is completely and utterly unscientific and completely useless. Now, the tests we're talking about, the infamous Drosten test, which is what the so-called Professor Drosten here from Charité University in Berlin invented in order to show the world that by using these tests, you can see infections, you can detect infections. This test was used worldwide because it was pushed by the WHO as a sort of gold standard to find out about how many infections there are with COVID-19.
Fascinating stuff. Dr. Rainer Fuellmich, thank you so much for taking the time today. And personally, I wish you great luck in your lawsuit against those tech companies and their censorship. I think it's needed badly, not just in Germany, but worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you guys for tuning into the podcast today. I hope that we have helped to shed some light on what's going on, again, with the coronavirus, with the issue of vaccines and masks and of shutdowns, whether they be personal shutdowns or social shutdowns or economic shutdowns, because all of it, as I said, is affecting all of us worldwide. We will continue to hold those who are in power accountable, and we will continue to dig in on this issue. You can find the very latest, of course, always at RT.com. I'm Ben Swan. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.